how good this C63 Coupe is. When I think electric mobility, I think the Flash. So guys, welcome back to RBR, and today we're testing our first ever EV, and it is the Mercedes Benz EQC 400 4MATIC. We're here in an exceedingly wet Oslo in Norway, but before I dive straight into the EQC, I want to talk a little bit about what Mercedes Benz has done in the past with electric cars. Did you guys know that back in the 1900s, they had a taxi that was called the Mercedes Benz Electric? Yeah, I know, it's quite an original name, isn't it? And that was powered by rechargeable batteries that would get swapped out at depot and put back in. And people loved it because it was quiet and good for going around Berlin. So that was one rather unknown part of history. And one part of history that MB would rather you forget was the B-Class electric drive. Now, I happened to have this car once for about a week, and I remember distinctly that 75% charged, this car had less capacity for range than my AMG GT R on reserve fuel with race mode on. Yeah, not great. And they've tested cars like the GLC F-Cell, for example, GLC type cars, always seeming to be the popular one. But the one that they're really interested in, like the rest of the world, are EVs, fully electric cars. And they're so interested that MB have now spent or plan to spend 10 billion euros on the new model lineup and 1 billion on just the batteries themselves. So they're taking this very seriously. And the first car of that range to come out to the public is this, the EQC. Now you're thinking, what does EQ mean? Well, think of it as a play on the word IQ. So it's electric intelligence. Don't ask me how that works, but that's what EQ means. And there are 3 sub-brands of EQ, because you guys have heard me speak about EQ in cars in the past. One, you have, for example, EQ Boost, which is very mild hybridization using 48-volt system, and you would remember that from any of the AMG 53s that I reviewed. The other is EQ Power. Now, currently, no EQ Power production car exists, but the GT 4-door concept previewed an EQ Power Plus Hyper AMG with 800 brake horsepower, produced by the marriage of V8 and an electric drivetrain. And finally, you've got full pure EQ cars like the EQC over here, fully electric with no combustion engine element at all. The basis for the car is, of course, the GLC. That's what it's built upon, that's what it's built around, that's the size of the car. And as such, you can see the shared kind of windshield and doors of the car. And it's also built in Bremen factory alongside the C-Classes and GLC. So they're making that entire factory capable of building not just the petrol, but these EQ cars on the same line as your regular Mercedes Benz. To your eyes and mine, this car looks like a traditional SUV. But MB insists that this is a cross between an SUV and an SUV coupe, so like a GLC SUV and a GLC coupe. So they're calling it like a crossover. And we'll explore that now as we get into the design. Now, with design on electric cars, there's one of 2 routes that all the automakers are taking at the moment. Either you have something like the Audi e-tron, where the car looks a lot closer to its combustion engine symbolings in a way not to alienate their customers and not to make it look like they're driving something zany. That's one way of doing it. Or you've got, like MB are doing, a completely separate design philosophy for their electric cars, really going for the futuristic and spaceship-like look. Now you can see that signature EQ look most of all in the front end of the EQ cars, and I'll get onto the other ones later. And the most interesting part to me is the horizontal light that sits within the main front fascia. This looks really interesting, and it's not been done in the car industry for a long time. It does link to the daytime running lights of modern Mercedes-Benz, but especially at night, it looks so interesting having that horizontal bar. And in some markets, you can even get the star lit up, and it works with Distronic cruise control for the first time as well. This car in particular is the AMG line. So it's got that AMG specific grille, kind of like the 53s, but of course, there's no air intakes because it is an electric car, and you do get that signature looking AMG A apron at the bottom. And if we looked at, say, the electric art version or the sport version, which is the other style that you can go for, then the front of that looks like this, and you've got the many slats of the front grille and a slightly different looking lower lower bumper. And of course, you get different wheel options across the board as well. You will notice a lot of use of blue as well. This is kind of the EQ color. So you'll see it inside of the standard multi-beam headlights. You'll see it on the EQ badge itself. And when you look at the badge, it's got different typography, and that carries across. If you look at the rear badges as well, it's just something a little different, a little more modern, completely different to what you've seen used typography-wise on Mercedes Benz before. You'll also notice as you come across the side, there's a lot of black plastic. Now, there's not a lot of room between the end of the car and the floor. It's more like a normal car, but there's a lot of bulk of cars. So they've used a lot of kind of black plastic to kind of hide that bulk. But when you kind of look at then the rear of the car, it doesn't quite look right to me. I think there's a bit too much black plastic going on there. Speaking of the rear, this is where I want to address that coupe stroke SUV look. You could kind of see how they've done it on the rear window line where it kind of stretches a bit more. And if we look at the rear properly, you'll even see how the MB Star is in the middle of the boot and the number plate sits on the bottom bumper, just like all the coupes. So they're really pushing that. I personally think if they'd just gone for, say, a coupe or maybe just an SUV, it maybe just would have looked better. I'm not sure why they've gone for this hybrid version. Equally, again, looking at the rear, you've got the horizontal light that goes straight across. Now that's going to remind you of cars like the Porsche Cayenne and, dare I say it, the Kia Sportage. It did remind me immediately of those, but this is the look that they're going for, both on the front and the rear of the EQC. And as a whole package, it does look totally different to your standard Mercedes Benz. And dare I say, it looks quite handsome in some angles. Don't crucify me for that, please. All of the wheel options that you have are all aerodynamically optimized. If you look at them close up, you'll see all of them have flat faces to allow that aerodynamic flow across the front of the wheel. So of course you can spec this car in quite a number of different ways. You have the electric art version or this AMG line version. I want to show you what it looks like in brilliant blue, for example, where I think it looks really quite stunning. And if you get the larger 21-inch AMG alloys, they look really, really good. Now I want to take a look at how the EQC looks inside. So let's strip away some of the outside and I want to show you what's underneath. So of course there's no engine in this car because it is all batteries. And we've got quite a few batteries in here. We have got 4 packs of 72 cell batteries and 2 packs of 48 cells. And they're laid at the lowest part of the car, so you have a low center of gravity across the bottom. The rear, you've got batteries stacked on top of each other as well. And of course then, these drive 2 separate electric drivetrains, one for each axle. So the front one gives you power for the low and mid-range, so your daily driving. And then your rear axle gives you power for more dynamic stuff. They can shift 100% of power between each other and they behave very much like your 4MATIC Plus all-wheel drive. So it is thus a 4MATIC system. Now those batteries feed to the wheel 408 brake horsepower, 765 Newton meters of torque, and gives you a 0 to 60 of 5 seconds. And of course, then that's why this model is called EQC 400, because it relates to the horsepower. A lot more easy to understand than Audi's e-tron 55, for example. But then this does have a similar curb weight to other EVs of 2.4 tons, which of course, it's going to play a part in the dynamics. Then we come to charging, and there's a number of ways that you can charge the EQC. First of all, you get an onboard charger of 7 kilowatts, and that you can of course use publicly or at home. And you can also get Mercedes to install an MB wallbox charger at your house. The car is also ready for DC charging, which is a much faster charging technology. But of course, this is not available in the UK, but in countries where it is, depending on the status of charge, you can go from 10 to 80% in say about 40 minutes to half an hour. But for home charging, you're going to look at 10 to 11 hours to get a full charge, so it's going to be an overnight thing. A lot of this decision of your buying this car is going to depend on the facilities and the infrastructure around you catching up with how ambitious the EU and the rest of the world is with EVs. The other bit on the inside is how far MB have gone to sound insulate this car. They've gone above and beyond, sound insulating loads of parts of the wheel arches, vents coming out of the wheel arch to stop noise from coming in the cabin. And you can just see some of these behind the scenes photos just to see how far they've gone to make sure that there's no sound coming into the cabin. And you're going to see later when I go on the drive just how silent this car is because of it. And that's one of the main areas that they're touting. But for Mercedes, this is a really important product. It's their first foray into the electric market. So it really has to stand out as a Mercedes Benz. It can't be like the other cars. So it'll be interesting to see what they do in the future as well, because when I think of Mercedes Benz, I think of S-Class, for example. And Mercedes have said that in the next gen of the S-Class, there is going to be, I guess, an EQS, they'll probably call it. So that'll be interesting. I'm sure they'll use a lot of the fascia, but it'll probably have a more luxurious twist to it. Of course, they've already showed us the EQA concept, so no doubt there will be some kind of EQA 200, EQA 250, etc. compact car. And then we've of course seen the EQV, which is the V-Class version. But I really want to see what we get in terms of a sports car, because I read some articles recently about AMG boss Tobias Moores talking with Linkin Park's Mike Shinoda about how an EV and a hybrid should sound. So maybe we'll end up getting something like an EQ GT. That could be pretty cool, but then they have to get the kind of artificial sound right on a product like that, don't you think? As fun as it is to look at a completely different design language, I really want to show you the inside of the car, because we've got some unique things for EQ cars on the inside as well. So guys, inside the EQC, it's rather different but familiar, and it's familiar of course because of that GLC factor. So you will notice like the whole center console looking very similar indeed, parts of the door cards, but then everything shifts when you look at this front section here, the driver zone and the front dashboard, all very different and unique to EQC. Now when I first saw the pictures, I found the asymmetrical design to be off-putting. And it seemed very kind of BMW to me, where things are kind of moving towards the driver's section, particularly this middle section of the vents. But sitting here as a driver, it looks a lot more pleasing to the eye. And then you start to notice the little and the big details that they've put specifically for the EQC. Now, of course, if you've got the double 12-inch screens, as you do, for example, in the E-Class, the new A-Class, etc., etc. So it's not two separate screens like in the facelift GLC. And then you start to see the cool things that they brought in. For example, these air vents, very kind of analog looking, and you notice the little like rose gold highlights on the vents themselves, completely different to what you'll find in GLC. And they look really, really good. Particularly, I like the vertical ones on each side of the dash, looking really quite interesting. And then speaking of the dash, on the rear part of it, you see this kind of vent design go all around the top of the car. And it reminds me distinctly of the type of design that they had in the 003 Aston hypercar. That's how kind of special it looks, and it flows all around the front of the car. Now this is of course an AMG line car, so you've got like mock carbon fiber trim, you've got extensive use of Dynamica alongside of the man-made leather. You'll also notice the material used on the top of the dashboard completely different to what you'd have in a normal Mercedes Benz. And the ambient lighting then looks quite stunning as it flows across that driver zone, extended drive zone area, I guess you'd call it, on the top of the dashboard. So there are some unique things within MBUX for the EQ cars. For example, if you've got the Mercedes Me app, you can set a departure time, and then pre-entry climate control will make sure that the car is warmed up, the windscreen is warmed, and everything is ready to go by the time that you get in the car. And you can do that straight from your phone or through MBUX itself. Additionally, for EQ cars, if you put in a charging station, it will begin to heat the batteries to the optimal temperature for charging, in preparation of the fact that you're going to charge the car and you want to charge it quickly, which is really clever. Plus, it will take the heat from the battery and heat up the interior rather than pulling power from the battery to do so, thus extending your range. So they're really linking various sensors and things together to make sure you're optimally using both heat and energy in this car. And of course, you've got the brilliant MBUX system. So your front dash has got different designs, so you can have the traditional ones such as Classic or Sport, as you have in all the other Mercedes Benz. But in Progressive, it looks quite good and it suits the whole EQ theme. Plus you get specific EQ tiles here. Of course, MBUX, as we tested in other cars recently, really advanced now. This one has got that latest one that we talked about in the GLE and in the new CLA. So we've got cameras up here, they're looking at what I'm doing. So the menu pops up and the stuff is highlighting when my finger is here. So for example, if we go into EQ, you can see EQ specific things here, such as searching for charging stations, that departure time thing that I spoke about, maximum charge state, maximum current charge, your consumption, energy flow. There's so many things in here that you can have a look at and keep an eye on where needed. But a lot of that information is very clearly visible on the driver zone as well. And of course, you can just speak to MBUX just naturally, for example, to look for a charging station, and we'll do that later on when I go on the drive. The other bit about the inside is you get as much space as you do in the standard GLC, and you don't get that, for example, in the e-tron, where you've got a lot less space than a Q7. So you've got as much space in the back. If you look at the boot, you've got an absolutely massive boot, the same litre capacity as the GLC. So in terms of space, you're not losing out by getting the EQC. Headlight in the rear is really good because it is basically an SUV. You haven't got a chopped off roofline. So tall people will be very, very comfortable in the back. So guys, that's some of the interior highlights and the tech for you on this car. I think it's pretty special inside, a lot better than the photos lead you to believe. But now let's take it on the road. Let's see just how Mercedes Benz it is. Is it Mercedes Benz enough, or is it just another EV with a different badge on it? So guys, let's start with the drive. And the first thing with the EQ car is, let's see what happens when you actually press the button on the electric Mercedes. And that's it. There's seldom even a beep. In fact, there's nothing. All it says here is ready to drive, as you saw in front there. Well, that's a little bit weird for me, because even in the Porsche Panamera SE Turbo hybrid thing, there was still a ba-bing, some kind of sound to tell you the car is on. I would have liked there to be like a specific EQ sound for the MBs. But anyway, let's get going now. We are currently in comfort mode. And look at that, no sound at all. So first impressions are interesting in that the car is completely silent. I'm not just talking about the engine, I'm talking about like noise insulation. It's like really quiet. I'm sure you guys can feel that even watching compared to my usual videos. And apart from that, we've got interesting kind of brake feel. I don't think it's like we're used to, and that's probably the recuperation aspect that you've got inside EVs. It's quite interesting seeing the accelerator, where you see the power build, and then when you brake or you let off and the power recuperates on the EQ dial here. Really good display, the EQ one for this. So MB say this car is a classic Mercedes, and it's all about quality, comfort and safety. And one word that you'll see missing within that statement is performance. And that's where we are going to start with the EQC 400. Then let's remind you of the performance figures. You've got 408 brake horsepower, 765 Newton meters of torque, which is some of the highest in the market, and a 0-60 of around 5.1 seconds. But you've also got an overall car weight of about 2.4 tons. Quite interestingly for me as an AMG addict, this puts this car quite close to the GLC 43 in terms of horsepower and 0-60 times. So let's note right now at the start, I've got 180 km range for just over half battery. I was about to say half a tank, petrol head things. So let's see later when I put the car into sport, start driving a bit more dynamically, how that affects real world usage in terms of range. Now let's see, what does that feel like? All you hear is a whir and a whoosh, but it does go quickly. So let's chuck the car now into sport. And I'm going to put my foot down, and there's nothing. It is so weird. Because the car is so silent and the noise insulation is so good, all you can see is something in the distance coming closer. And you get so much grip out of it, but there's just no hiding the weight. You cannot hide the weight. It really feels like you're pulling something that is 30% heavier than a normal GLC. Luckily, the body roll isn't there, which is very important. You don't want that. And you must remember the center of gravity is very low because all the battery packs are down there. And it all feels very clinical. You got a lot of grip because of the 4MATIC. Again, I'm kind of comparing it to GLC 43. And even though the figures are very similar, you really can't discern anything. All you get is an extremely, I kind of liken it to how you feel going fast in the S-Class, but minus the diesel sound. It's really strange, and it's very fast. But the thing about this is, it hasn't got even a tenth of the excitement of, say, the GLC 43. Yet the entry level of this car sits at the GLC 63 levels of, you know, this size of SUV. But I think that's an unfair comparison to make, because Look, in the current world, EVs are expensive. We just have to accept that. You look at the ridiculous price of the top of the line Tesla Model X as an example. So yeah, you're paying a premium for this car being an EV, but that's across the board on all manufacturers. What we must look at instead is this car is much more like, say, a GLC 350. And that's what I want to compare it against performance-wise. And when you compare it to that car, this car gives you a lot more because it's faster. You've still got the 4MATIC, but the level of comfort is just on another level. You haven't got any drudgy engine noise. It's completely sound insulated, and I've seldom driven anything like it in that sense. And yes, when you can perceive how fast you're going, it is very fast indeed. But talking about speed, it tops off at 115 miles per hour, which compared to the e-tron, the I-Pace, and forget about the 155 mile per hour Model X, makes it the slowest in that sense of the bunch. This is not such a big problem, say, in the UK, but I would love to know from you Autobahn users what you think of that, because obviously that's gonna hinder this car. And the braking is okay. It's not kind of as bad as I've heard it is in a lot of other EVs where you've got this kind of numbness. There is a little bit at the start, and obviously that's the recuperation element, and you've got haptic on your pedals here to kind of tell you with the accelerator when to pull off to save on range and then recoup some energy, etc. Now, in terms of economy, after I've been driving fast just now, it's gone from what we started for half battery at 180-ish down to 132. So I'm going to put the car now back into comfort. Now, when we started off, it was at 180 for just over 50% battery, which is close enough to that 450 km estimate. So we know that if you're driving sensibly, the car will give you kind of close to the range that you're expecting. I think something like 200, 220 miles is about what you're going to get from sensible driving out of the EQC. And you can aid in the recuperation levels as well. Now, you notice we got paddles here, which I wasn't using during dynamic driving because that's not what they are for. So if we're going down a hill like we are now, I can tap the down pedal and you see a minus come next to the D, and that helps slow down the car and increase the recuperation. And when you go into double minus, you get this mode, which is called one pedal driving. Essentially, the car is constantly trying to brake itself, so you don't need to touch the brake pedal at all. All you need to do is accelerate and the car will take care of the stopping. But it actually becomes quite intuitive after you start using it, as weird as it sounds. But on the other side, you've got pluses. And when you do the plus, so a gear shift up if you like, that turns the car into a sailing or coasting mode. So the car then sails and again recoups as much energy as it can while you've got that plus going. Hold the upshift and you get D auto, and this then manages the distance between you and the car in front while recuperating energy using Distronic, and then all you need to do is speed up again yourself. The car also has something called Eco Assist, and that uses all the data available to the car, like navigation data, elevations, traffic sign assist, etc., to help with that element of recuperation, coasting, sailing, etc., all with this idea of getting you the most range as possible. Now, since we started driving more economically, you can see the range has gone up to 146, so it's working. It's using both my driving style and the data available to it to recuperate as much energy as possible, giving me more miles. And really, I mean, how many people are going to be doing more than 200 miles a day? I don't think that there's that many of us who are going to do that. But still, this ends up kind of then being the second car just for that occasion where you do need to do more miles, especially in the UK where we just haven't got access to the quick charge DC ports. Now I want to get on to what I have found after driving this is really the big selling point for me. It's the luxury element. Because this car is so sublime to drive around. It's literally like a tall S-Class, more than any other MB SUV I've driven. It goes about its business with such ease. The suspension is brilliant. It's fair enough, okay, the Norway roads are really, really good, so I'd like to see what this is like in bumpy UK roads, but it is really, at the moment, sublime. Hey Mercedes.
How may I help you?
Where's the next charging station?
Select an entry, please.
And it's really as simple as that. Just like you're used to with all your other MBUX commands, you just gotta ask it. There's no script, just talk naturally. Now, sound or lack thereof is of course always an issue. Now, I think you need sound, even if it's artificial, just to show kind of what the car is doing. So, you know, what is the car doing mechanically? What can you bring out? You know, there has to be something that can be done. I mean, for example, what if I put some sound in now? Let's accelerate like this. Or maybe something like this. You may think it ridiculous. What if it was a TIE fighter? I have you now. But I think whoever cracks that nut is going to reap the rewards, because that's when you'll grab the attention of petrol heads who are used to some kind of reward orally for driving more dynamically or picking up speed. So let's look at the highlights of this car. You have got 400-ish brake horsepower, a 0 to 60 of around about 5 seconds. You've got electric motors acting like all-wheel drive, a curb weight of 2.5 tons, and a real-world usage of about 200 miles. Now, the worrying thing is, I could have replaced EQC with almost any rival on the market. And that's kind of a problem that is exasperated with the EVs, because with petrol cars, yes, a C63 and an M3 have very similar stats, but then they're differentiated by gearbox, exhaust sound, suspension, differentials, the damn engine itself. I mean, how do you differentiate a battery from a battery? You can't. So it's kind of becoming, what's your favorite brand? You know, what do you want this same kind of car packaged in? I mean, why would the Audi guy go for an EQC over an e-tron? It's a genuine question. I really don't think that they would. Whereas if you ask me for reasons as to why he should get a GLC 43 over a SQ5, I could probably write you a book myself. So until these cars begin to differentiate more on a mechanical level or on some level technically, it's really going to be a case of what brand you prefer, kind of like a smartphone really. But for the EQC, this is where it kind of takes the cake, because in terms of brand power, it truly is the Mercedes Benz of electric cars. It's damn quiet, it's super, super comfortable and luxurious, and it's got probably the best in-car operating system, or one of the best at least, that you will have in any car. And you drive any car without it, you start to miss MBUX. It's really that good. Then of course you've got the styling. Having seen it in person, apart from the bulkiness of the rear, I really do like that front end. I think it works as a kind of future Mercedes Benz, but I want to see more models. More specifically, I want to see something a bit more sporty. And of course you benefit from the gigantic dealer network of Mercedes Benz, and you cannot discount that. The EV market is an interesting one at the moment. I feel like it's a testing bed, not just for the manufacturers, but for us as drivers to kind of get a taste of how good it could be. I think the future generations of cars, they're going to be lighter because they're going to be built from the ground up rather than based on something else. And I'm hoping that the technology between the brands is going to start to differentiate more and more, so you get a much bigger difference between the brands. And I'm hoping cars like the Porsche Taycan, and when AMG eventually get into the game, will really start to heat things up. Until that happens, electric now truly does have a Mercedes Benz. This is up there with the S-Class in terms of refinement, comfort and luxury, and I'm super impressed with the range. Again, I'm going to go back to it and show you it here live. I'm still at 136 and I've been driving for at least an hour now. It's pretty damn good, guys. And remember, this is at the moment actually one of the most affordable SUV EVs that you can get. So guys, thank you so much for watching this, our first EV review on the Move Before Race. So happy that it is a Mercedes Benz as our first. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do like, subscribe and share this video if you did. And as always, I'm going to blast off, even in an EV. So I'll see you next time. Zoom.